Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
A couple people sent me a crazy story out of Alabama involving a Hyundai factory, subsidiary factory. So, a lot of car companies have suppliers, and some car companies own the suppliers, at least partially. They've got a stake in the supplier. So what's happening here is a Hyundai subsidiary has used child labor at an Alabama factory. This is from Reuters. Joshua Schneer, Mika Rosenberg, and Christina Cook all wrote this. A subsidiary of Hyundai Motor Company has used child labor at a plant that supplies parts for the Korean carmaker's assembly line in nearby Montgomery. That's according to the area police, the family of 3 underage workers, and 8 former and current employees of the factory. So they've done their homework on this and said this is not just a rumor. It's not. We're getting information from a whole bunch of different sources, and it makes it look like this is really going on. Underage workers, in some cases as young as 12, have recently worked at a metal stamping plant, operated by Smart Alabama LLC. Smart is listed by Hyundai in corporate filings as a majority-owned unit, and it supplies parts for some of the most popular cars and SUVs built by the automaker in Montgomery. That is their flagship U.S. assembly plant. In a statement sent after Reuters first published a story on this, Hyundai said it does not tolerate illegal employment practices at any Hyundai entity. We have policies and procedures in place that require compliance with all local, state, and federal laws. So they say they've got rules in place and they don't tolerate this. So how did it happen? Well, they wouldn't answer any detailed questions following up on that. But Smart, which is the subsidiary, in a separate statement said it also follows federal, state, and local laws and denies any allegation that it knowingly employed anyone who is ineligible for employment. The question is, then how could this happen? Well, the company said it relies on temporary work agencies to fill jobs and expects these agencies to follow the law in recruiting, hiring, and placing workers on its premises. So you've got Hyundai, which is the assembly plant and the company, and then they've got a supplier, Smart Alabama LLC, which is apparently partially owned by Hyundai. And the workers here, some of them are underage, and when asked how could that happen, they say, Smart says, well, there are agencies who provide us employees and we rely on them. So they're going to blame it on the contractor. So a 12-year-old kid shows up for work and doesn't raise any whistles or bells or flags or warnings because you rely on the contractor to only be hiring people of the proper age to work at your metal stamping plant. Smart didn't answer specific questions either about the workers cited in the story or on the job scenes they and other people familiar with the factory described. Reuters learned of underage workers at the Hyundai-owned supplier following the brief disappearance in February of a Guatemalan migrant child from her family's home in Alabama. The girl, 13 years old, and her 2 brothers, aged 12 and 15, all worked at the plant earlier this year at the metal stamping plant and weren't going to school, according to people familiar with their employment. Can't go to school today, go at the metal stamping plant. And yes, I'm emphasizing that. The police helped locate the missing girl at the time of their search, identified her by name in a public alert, but her name's not in this story because she's a minor. She's a minor. The police force in Enterprise, about 45 miles from the plant in Laverne, doesn't have jurisdiction to investigate possible labor law violations at the factory. Instead, the force notified the state attorney general's office after the incident. James Sanders, an Enterprise police detective, told Reuters, there actually are federal laws on child labor, interestingly enough. Now, Mike Lewis, a spokesperson at the Alabama Attorney General's office, declined to comment. It's unclear whether the office or other investigators have contacted Smart or Hyundai about possible violations. On Friday, in response to these reports, a spokesperson for the Alabama Department of Labor said it would be coordinating with the U.S. Department of Labor and other agencies to investigate. So the U.S. Department of Labor is involved. The children in this family, by the way, have now all enrolled in the upcoming school terms. They'll be going to school in the fall. But they were among a larger cohort of underage workers who found jobs at the Hyundai-owned supplier over the past few years, according to interviews with a dozen former and current plant employees and labor recruiters. Several of those minors, they said, have foregone schooling in order to work long shifts at the plant, which is a sprawling facility with a documented history of health and safety violations, including amputation hazards because, of course, it is a metal stamping plant. Most of the current and former employees who spoke with Reuters did so on the condition of anonymity. Reuters was unable to determine the precise number of children who may have worked at the factory, what the minors were paid, or other terms of their employment. The question is, if they're underage, do you still pay them the same amount you pay an adult? And if you didn't know they were underage, of course you'd pay them the same amount, right? That'll be an interesting thing to look at. The revelation of child labor in Hyundai's U.S. supply chain could spark consumer, regulatory, and reputational backlash for one of the most powerful and profitable automakers in the world. In a human rights policy posted online, Hyundai says it forbids child labor throughout its workforce, including suppliers. So that's what makes it all the more surprising. They claim they're against this. The company recently said it will expand in the U.S., planning over $5 billion in investments, including a new electric vehicle factory near Savannah, Georgia. David Michaels, a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Labor for OSHA, or the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, said that consumers should be outraged. They should know these cars are being built, at least in part, by workers who are children and need to be in school rather than risking life and limb because their families are desperate for income. At a time of U.S. labor shortages and supply chain disruptions, labor experts told Reuters there are heightened risks that children, especially undocumented migrants, could end up in workplaces that are hazardous and illegal for minors, such as metal stamping plants. In Enterprise, home to a bustling poultry industry, Reuters earlier this year chronicled how a Guatemalan miner who came to the U.S. alone found work at a local chicken processing plant. Now, Alabama and federal law limits minors under the age of 18 from working in metal stamping and pressing operations such as smart, where proximity to dangerous machinery can put them at risk. Alabama law also requires children 17 and under to be enrolled in school. Now, Michaels, the person who spoke earlier for OSHA, he's now a professor at George Washington University, said safety at U.S.-based Hyundai suppliers was a recurrent concern at OSHA during his 8 years leading the agency. Now, he left there in 2017, but he visited Korea in 2015, and he said he warned Hyundai executives that his heavy demand for just-in-time parts was causing safety lapses. The smart plant builds parts for the popular Elantra, Sonata, and Santa Fe models, vehicles that through June accounted for almost 37% of Hyundai's U.S. sales, according to them. The factory has received repeated OSHA penalties for health and safety violations, federal records show. A Reuters review of records shows Smart has been assessed with at least $48,000 in OSHA penalties since 2013 and is most recently fined this year. OSHA inspections at Smart have documented violations including crush and amputation hazards at the factory where they do metal stamping. The plant, whose website says it has the capacity to supply parts for up to 400,000 vehicles each year, has also had difficulties retaining labor to keep up with Hyundai's demand. In late 2020, Smart wrote a letter to U.S. consular officials in Mexico seeking a visa for a Mexican worker. The letter is written by a Smart general manager and reviewed by Reuters, and it said the plant was severely lacking in labor and that Hyundai will not tolerate such shortcomings. Smart didn't answer Reuters' questions about that letter. Earlier this year, attorneys filed a class action lawsuit against Smart and several staffing firms who help supply workers with U.S. visas. The legal action is filed in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia on behalf of a group of about 40 Mexican workers and alleges some employees hired as engineers were ordered to work menial jobs instead. Smart, in court documents, called the allegations baseless and meritless. Many of the miners at the plant were hired through recruitment agencies, according to current and former Smart workers and local labor recruiters. Although staffing firms help fill industrial jobs nationwide, they've often been criticized by labor advocates because they enable large employers to outsource the responsibility for checking the eligibility of employees to work. So that is the issue. There's much, much more to the story. It's a long, long story from Reuters. But You've got 12 and 13-year-old kids working in a plant. And I know that some people are going to say, Steve, once in a while, you can encounter a 13-year-old kid or a 12-year-old kid who looks much older than that. But I've never met a 12-year-old kid that if I spent any length of time with them, I wouldn't realize that they were 12 years old, or at least that they weren't an adult, right? How do they get to work? Are they driving there? Oh, they can't drive because they haven't got driver's licenses. So how are they getting to work? And assuming they get breaks sometime, I'm assuming they get breaks even at a metal stamping plant. During the breaks, what do they talk about? Do they sound like adults when they talk? 12-year-old, 13-year-old? So I find it very hard to believe that no one figured this out. And so, of course, the factory where the cars are being built says we know nothing about that because all those underage workers are at the supplier. But the supplier's got a bunch of these underage workers, and they say, well, it's not our fault because they came from recruiting firms. And again, I think it falls apart there because when the 12-year-old and 13-year-old show up for work, it shouldn't be that difficult to ask very basic questions and figure out that they're actually not old enough to be working. Call me crazy, but I think that's the case. I know that once in a while when I go out on a limb like that, people go crazy and they start attacking, saying, how can you say that? Because I once met a 13-year-old who looked 19. Okay. Maybe they're working at this plant. And if so, congratulations, because you now intersect with the story. I find it hard to believe. But again, I'm letting you know that's my personal opinion. I find it hard to believe. So Hyundai subsidiary has used child labor at an Alabama factory, not just one, but more than a few, and including at a metal stamping plant. So Daryl and Chad both sent this to me. Joshua Schneer, Mika Rosenberg, and Christina Cook all contributed and wrote that story for Reuters. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. I have a new philosophy. I'm only going to dread one day at a time.